and happy that everybody is safe and warm and enjoying from the comfort of their own home. My name's Gail Baker. I'm a co-chair of the Programs Committee, and our program tonight is going to be nice and warm because part of it's about fire. So before we do that, I do have a couple of announcements and just a bit of background as people are coming in. So we'll begin with that. And also I want a big thank you to the board and to our speaker Bart for putting all this together as a quick pivot from in-person to Zoom, which we learned over the last couple of years. All right, so let's get going here. I first want to do a couple of recognitions, and can you all see my screen with the Calapooya map? Is that okay? Yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, you got it. All right, so a quick, some recognitions that we are broadcasting living on the homeland of the Calapooya peoples, and we want to honor that. And also, we have learned that recognition is a good start, but action is the next step. And so we really want to invite our audience and our attendees to reach out and to suggest to us and to suggest some actions that we as a Native Plant Society could do that would reciprocally benefit both ourselves and the Indigenous communities here. So please contact our chapter president if you have ideas, and we will go from there and hopefully include actions in with our acknowledgements. And because it's Martin Luther King Day, we also would like to acknowledge Black and brown botanists and hope to encourage that diversity in our field. And so some ones from the past, early in the 1900s. And these three people, among many, are recognized. And who are they? Well, O'Reilly Ray Collins actually worked to discover slime mold mating types. So those of you who are kind of myco interested, that might be interesting for you. Mary Clark Tyler studied plant growth and its response to light with some interesting information there. And currently Sandra Clement Nagusin studies nutrient recycling in lakes. And the next person that I want to recognize, Dr. Sean Abrams, if anybody is interested in his podcast, Hidden Stories of Plant Science, I recommend it. And it highlights how Black people are responsible for vanilla cupcakes and even with microscopes. So really recognize the diversity in our community, in our science community, and kind of start those investigations. So please take advantage of that if you're interested. Our next program, next February, will be on Zoom because it is from Davis, California. Our presenter, our two presenters actually, Allison Caldwell and Adam Schneider, and they worked on the Orobanchaceae. Many of you are familiar with Orobanchaea uniflora and some of the plants at the coast that were Bosniacia and have now a new genus. But they're going to talk about their discoveries, the ecology, and their how that affects the Oregon flora. So hopefully you can join us for that in a month. It's also on a holiday weekend. So keep that in mind, and it will, of course, the announcement will be on the chapter website as well. We are going to have a field trip this winter. Hopefully it won't be icy. I tried to walk out there today. It was really icy and slick, but hopefully by February 10th at the Arboretum, we'll be able to walk around and take a look at those very early blooms that we might see in the Howard Buford Recreation Area. And the information again is on the website. Registering for that walk is also in the website. We'll see early blooms of the hazelnut, maybe some snow queen, and lots of others. So hope you can all join us for that. Again, information on our website, registration on the Emerald Chapter website. And there's also some chapter opportunities. We're hoping to have a communications committee chair. And if you are interested in either of these positions that I'm talking about, please contact Jenny at the MCHAP president website, or not website, but email list right there. And you can also contact through the website. So we're looking for a communications chair, and we're also looking for a treasurer for this year. Both of our current members have done a wonderful job and they're moving on, and we'd love to have other people join us. So please consider that, or anything else that you might be interested in, and let us know. So just some housekeeping before I introduce our speaker. Please post your questions in chat, and Bart will address them at the end. And I will be keeping track of your questions on chat and field them for Bart. So your questions can be addressed at the end of the talk. And during the talk, at least please keep your sound on mute. Bart said it's great to have an audience to look at, so you're welcome to keep your videos on. And really want to thank everybody for supporting NPSO and joining us tonight. I'm really happy about that. So my next slide will be introduction to Bart. And we're really happy to have him here, happy that it all worked out on Zoom. Bart is Professor Emeritus of Landscape Architecture at the University of Oregon. And his research focuses on enhancing society's capacity to adapt and innovate in the face of climate change. So what's happening tonight? Climate change, with a particular focus on wildfire, fire stewardship, and sustaining life's diversity. And I know Bart is a knowledgeable, thoughtful, and engaging speaker. So we're all looking forward to this. And thank you, Bart. And I will stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours.
Okay, sounds good. Can you all hear me there? Have I unmuted appropriately? So thank you for all being here tonight. Really, really appreciate this. Between having COVID in October and we had to cancel, and then the ice storm tonight, it was like, when and where and is this talk going to happen? So delighted to see you all here. Especially appreciate you being here tonight, despite all the other opportunities you had to go out for a night on the town. So let me see if I can share screen here. And then get to the presentation. Okay. So are you seeing my title slide there? A thumbs up from somebody? Thank you. Great. Well, the topic is ambitious, but why not? I'm going to argue these issues have important ramifications for the Willamette Valley and other parts of the West. And I hope we're going to have time to discuss them at the end, particularly whether I blow past something so fast. It's like, what was that about? But even more of just, really discussing these issues, getting down to the meat of them with you. I'm going to seam together a number of different concepts tonight that lead to a core idea that I think may help link the past and present to the future of our landscape. And let me get my controls working here. All right, should be seeing the second screen. So apparently Einstein didn't actually say this, but I resonated to it as a researcher. This idea that if we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't be called research. My curiosity drives me to ask questions about things I don't know much about. And to investigate them, I have to speculate and go out on limbs and only later find out if they hold up. So I'm going to do a bit of that with you tonight. I've been working with oak and prairie grasslands for nearly 30 years now. It's been a real passion of mine. And much what I've learned is from gathering data and doing statistics. And a whole lot of that too is just simply walking around, paying attention to the stories the landscape has to tell. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of data today and mostly try to tell a story of what I've learned and where it may lead. So a proposition can mean many things. Some consider less than appropriate in polite company, but I'm going to use a mathematical definition that a proposition is a statement that's either true or false. And I'm going to examine each one of the following using evidence, warrants that link evidence to the claims that are being made, and first principles, I mean, foundational beliefs and logical chains that you rely on to guide your thinking when you don't have enough data. So proposition 1, oak savanna grasslands have been in the Pacific Northwest for a long time and appear well suited to future climate because of the resilience to and tolerance of heat, drought, and fire. There's strong scientific evidence for this, and I'd say confidence is high. Proposition 2, that the histories of oak savanna grasslands have long been linked to those of indigenous people. Strong cultural and scientific evidence, confidence very high, but there's some real nuances there in understanding to the degree the reciprocal influences between savannas on indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples on the savannas and the prairies that we'll have to dive into. Proposition 3 is that the care and sophistication of indigenous peoples' processing of grassland goods and services were likely matched by those of their management activities. And have to draw on evidence from other landscapes and first principles in large part because our local knowledge was lost before it could be recorded or carried forward into the future to a large degree, not completely, but there are other places we can draw from. So confidence really in this argument depends on who you are to a large degree. Proposition 4, we need to prepare the land to receive and transmit fire safely at broad spatial extents with the sophistication and localized place knowledge of the indigenous cultures who inhabited and managed this land for thousands of years. This is really where I'm trying to lead, is to understand not reproducing what was here before, but building from indigenous knowledge, working with indigenous people, and bringing on our own science to understand how we can apply fire carefully, safely, in the ways to do the things we want to do in the current conditions of the landscape. So proposal, database speculation, I'd say confidence is medium till we can test it. So I've structured the talk around 6 sections that allow me to build and seam together those 4 propositions, and I'll periodically remind you of where and how those propositions fit into the storyline. Start from here. Why do these grasslands matter in the Willamette Valley? Well, of course, the first point is just this tremendous biodiversity values they have in terms of associated native vertebrate species, over 700 native plant species, 1,000 species of arthropods, many species of native bees, many of which are extirpated, federally listed species. I say that's matched by their cultural values that include the indigenous uses, land stewardship and forest foods, aesthetic, recreational, spiritual values, and a host of other values, including, importantly, mitigating wildfire risk and climate resilience. So this slide, and I encourage you to look it up later in the IPCC report, which is online. But the world is changing rapidly before our eyes. I never thought I would be in the midst of the amount of climate change that we're seeing manifesting in front of our eyes, despite the fact that I've been studying it and researching it for 30, 40 years now. This diagram shows from the left to the right on that colored timeline, the average global temperature is around 1900. The color is based on the average between 1850 and 1900. And as it builds up, these warmer and warmer colors tracking through time each year until we reach 2020. And then as you move into the future, there are different lines depending on the different emission scenarios of greenhouse gases, which lead to very low, which we're not doing, to very high, which is about where we are. what the expected average global temperature being ran. And the impactful part of this slide to me is these storylines below about what would be like for somebody born in about 1950, a little before I was born, who was living under these kinds of temperatures and the heating up that has occurred in the lifetime of somebody like me, who's just about 70 years old right now, compared to somebody who was born in 1980, who's about 40 years old now, and this speculative future where there are different color bands depending on what emissions scenario we are, but they're all redder. And then soberingly, for a child born in 2020 here, what it may be like when they reach 70 years old around 2090. So what we have to adapt to in terms of climate change, because it is happening, determines a lot on where we are. And it's pretty easy to argue that one of the big things in the American West is wildfire. So what the heck happened in 2020? We had these enormous sets of wildfires. On the left, you see the area burned and structures destroyed with the fires across Oregon, and the footprints of some further south in California. On the one hand, they were enormous, but they weren't unprecedented. When we look at maps and records of fire regimes in the Cascades and the Coast Range, we can see these suites of large standard placing events and fires that have occurred in the past. What wasn't new was large fires. It wasn't new that there were east winds driving them. But what was new was under increased aridity, we're seeing a increasing coupling of climate and fuel moisture. I mean, at the time those fires burned, logs in much of the Cascades were like kiln dried lumber, right? We're seeing longer fire seasons. And we're also seeing an overlap of fire seasons with the thin winds, the east winds. In California, they're called the Santa Anas. And under climate change, we're actually seeing a weakening of the Santa Anas, but the fire season is moving into the Santa Ana season, increasing wildfire. We did a number of simulations in a study area around Eugene Springfield, that area that's gray around there, about back in 2013. And we tested several different climate scenarios, different climate models. And on the left is sort of the median run with a 50-year fire footprint in red for that Muroc GCM. This was the most extreme run we saw out of 50 simulations, which included one mega fire. There's about 5,900 hectares, about as big as anything that's occurred in the lower elevations of Willamette Valley in record. And then this scenario on the right from the Hadley climate model, basically all hell breaks loose, started about 2015. And we were getting ready to publish that. We kept expecting pushback from reviewers to say, well, that's just ridiculous. You're having 20,000, 40,000 hectare fires in the Willamette Valley. This is just, again, the median run. But in fact, along comes 2020, and that is quite as accurately as I can map it, the size and location of the Holiday Farm Fire, which came pretty darn close to Springfield. And if those east winds had picked up, it would have been a completely different game if they continued over time. So what does it matter? Wildfires are becoming larger and more severe. Western wildfires are projected to double in area in the next century. We need to act now to pre-adapt future wildfire before we're taken by surprise by it. And in part, one of the arguments I want to present tonight, and you've probably heard it from others, is that mosaics that include grasslands can interrupt forest fire flow, reduce fire severity, and facilitate suppression. One of the big questions is to readapt, we need to rethink what makes a good landscape. These are some drawings from my landscape architecture studio where we worked with homeowners who had lost their homes during the Holiday Farm Fire. In the upper left here, you see a LiDAR-based representation. So it's an accurate representation of the density and canopy cover of the forest prior to the fire. This is what it looked like in their property after the fire, again, according to LiDAR. And you see our proposals going into the future, not restoring what was there, but of actually looking toward a very different type of more open fire forest in the future that included oaks and grasslands that we don't typically think of as being up along the Mackenzie there as part of adapting to climate resilience. Somebody, if they can mute, somebody's unmuted there. So what do we mean by ancient grasslands? I've seen Mount Pisgah is a window into the past. I look down in there and I see remnants of what the landscape might have looked like back in the middle of the 1800s, but how long into the past? The first point is that oftentimes there's a signature in the soil of grasslands, mollisols. They result from long-term above and below ground development of soils. And over here on the right, I want to show you this picture of good old California oakgrass, Xanthonia californica, and the remarkable root system it can have to draw carbon, put carbon underneath the soil, build organic matter, and build fertility and productivity over time. So there's a map here on the upper left of world mollisols going down to the United States, the lower right, and then showing that over here, our little corner of the West Coast, there's quite an extensive footprint of the Willamette Valley of mollisols, of grassland soils, taking a long time to develop. You also see smaller footprints, but still substantial, up in the Puget Trough, which was glaciated, which may have interrupted a fair bit of that, and then down in southern Oregon. And across that 600-kilometer gradient from north to south, there are all kinds of flavors of these Cascadian interior lowland prairies and oak grasslands that had a sort of core set of species, including Quercus garryana across that entire range, and of variations in the bunch grasses and the forbs that are dominant, but again, a core group of species that persisted across that entire climate gradient there. This is a mapping from Historical General Land Office survey maps of what the distribution of the prairies in yellow and the savannas and woodlands in brown looked like in roughly the late 1850s, late 1800s. And then in the blink of an eye, by 2004, they're pretty much gone. I think most people know the story of what happened to them. We'll just touch on that today. We've lost them dominantly. We're trying to recover them. The question is why, how, where, who pays for it? And let's delve into that some more. But I want to think for a while with you just about how different it would have been to live in the Willamette Valley when it was like that. This map by Christian Alverson is a more detailed one that shows the prairies in tan, the savannas in orange, the woodlands in brown there, the gallery forests. And even here, we are here, well, we would have been here if it weren't for the ice storm, down in the Amazon Community Center in this spur of wet prairie surrounded by upland prairie and savanna on parts of the valley floor and all the hillsides here. There were open grasslands. Savanna is basically less than 25 canopy cover, just scattered open grown trees, oaks, pines, some fir. And just to imagine what that landscape would be like, I look at places I've been, such as Gabon or the Kazakh Prairie in Kansas or up on the Tibetan Plateau, and to understand what it would be like to live in those places and to build an economy and a way of life that was structured on a savanna grassland. So we have some accounts from some settler diaries, wide extended undulating prairies scattered over with magnificent oaks. The prairies were again seen carpeted with the most luxuriant growth of flowers, and the richest tints of red, yellow, and blue, extending in places a distance of 15 to 20 miles. That's like the horizon, right? To 41. And then this is my favorite one of them all from the settler diary. We would turn out our cattle on the valley, and they would immediately be lost in the tall grass, which reached higher than their backs. It was impossible to find them by sight. One might pass within a few feet without finding them. Imagine that when your cattle would disappear in the grasses. And there are people talking about the providence of those prairies. That's why they named it Goshen and Pisgah, these names in the Bible. They thought they'd come to the promised land in this amazingly productive landscape and beautiful landscape. So let's build from there, thinking more about the past and the future. And I want to really develop this proposition that oak savanna grasslands have been here for a long time and appear well suited to future climate because of their resilience to tolerance of heat, drought, and fire. This is a paleoecology map, a little hard to read perhaps. Time begins down at 14,000 years before present here, the lower part, and goes up toward the present. But the points I want to just make out of this is that oaks and grassland species have been persistent in the Pacific Northwest for millennia. And in fact, they were much more prominent 5 to 11,000 years ago, sort of the peak of the oak grassland taxon in this northern part of the Willamette Valley where this study was taken. And typically, that prominence of the oak and grassland taxa are associated with evidence of more frequent and extensive fires. So fire and climate, more prominent oaks in the past. If we also look at the past in this reconstruction, it's a little hard to tell from the colors, but basically when we look at 11,000 years before present, 6,000, and then present, it was hotter and it was drier. So during the peak, when those oaks and grasslands are doing better, it was hotter and drier in the summer than it was today. So can we expect oaks to do well under future climate? They've done well in the past, but what's it going to mean when the average daily temperatures may be 2 to 5 degrees Celsius hotter than they are today? So I think part of the answer is we look around us. When you're all plant people, you look around a lot. We know that oaks have wide environmental tolerances. This quote by Logan Bryant, or William Logan Bryant, says it specializes and not specialized. And the physiological adaptations of a classic stress tolerant really characterize Quercus garryiana. It can persist on these shallow soils and droughty hot exposures up above, and it can do well in flooded sites with Oregon ash there, because the physiological adaptations to drought are almost identical to those of flooding. So to give an examples of how well Quercus garryiana does in other climates today, you can see these responses to extreme climate locating in how it locates moisture in arid landscapes of eastern Washington, finding cool aspects and moisture-enhancing drainages along these hot slopes in the Columbia Gorge, and responses to extreme fire. It can become a dwarf forest, 2 to 4 foot tall on hot, windy exposures with frequent past fire. And then in areas with frequent fire, you see it forming these fairy rings of oaks where a central initial trunk is burned back to the ground, but they're resilient. They basal sprout, and then those trunks get burned back to the ground, and it sprouts out further until I've seen them sometimes 10-foot diameter fairy rings of oaks under real extreme fire regimes. It's extremely resilient to fire and to extreme climate. This is not some Quercus garryiana down here, but also other oaks. They confer ecosystem resilience to fire when they're present as a dominant or a subdominant tree species. So here's the Kalmiopsis wilderness, a picture I took right after the Biscuit Fire in 2002, almost a complete stand replacing fire across that entire slide. And then right down below there is what was happening 3 years later, when those subdominant oaks were regenerating and a conifer forest was turning into an oak woodland, quickly establishing forest cover. And then finally, we can go all the way down to Southern California, talk about heat, talk about drought on the southern exposures, and see these scattering. Those are the crowns of Oregon white oak mixed in with a bunch of shrubs down there. So it does pretty well across a wide range of environments now. Our summers are getting hotter and drier. What about the future? The last piece of evidence I want to put before you is this climate envelope model of Quercus garryiana by Bart et al. There are caveats around climate envelope models, but this one was really well crafted towards a single species, not a broad range of species. You can see on the left the current range of Quercus garryiana. There is their modeled range under historical climate, not a bad match. And under even the most extreme future climate model, they show Quercus garryiana expanding its range. So to put a wrap on that, that's the evidence I have, and I feel pretty confident that if we want climate resilient tree species in the Pacific Northwest, the Willamette Valley future, we don't have to look any further than our Quercus garryiana. We don't have to look very far south. We don't have to go outside our ecoregion. We might encourage things like Quercus chrysolepis or some of our other oaks from a little further south, but Quercus garryiana seems quite well adapted to what's going to come in the future here. So, but where in the landscape might oaks do well? Well, they were formerly distributed across a wide range of terrain, soil types, from prime agricultural soils to harsh rocky slopes. It makes sense to me that given that oaks currently do well on really hot, dry sites in the Willamette Valley where we see them, that they should do well at the very least on cooler mesic sites, even if their tolerances were exceeded on the harshest slopes. And we can also, I think, look to cooler sites and higher elevations as places where oaks can become more prominent. We're often familiar with slow-growing oaks on harsh sites that were too unproductive for agriculture, too steep for development, and too stressful for rapid Douglas for infill. I didn't age these particular oaks, but I've done enough of that to say they're about 150 years old. Now take a look at that oak on the left. That's 147 years old. We did age that, growing on prime agricultural soil. Not surprisingly, when oaks get good soil and they're good water availability, they grow fast, they can reestablish well. And you see over on the right here, a site up near Alpine, don't know how that oak is, but they can grow big. And you can recover these oak savannas with full-grown oaks quite quickly if we don't just focus on those stressful sites, but move back onto these more productive soils that were part of the historical range. So basically, oak savanna thrived in the valley wherever it was supported by fire regime. The vegetation in the valley was very plastic. It could be this or that. And essentially, oaks have been pinched between a prairie and a forest. It's really hard for them to sustain themselves on the productive soils of the prairies where you have really dense fuels, and when they burn, they're really hot. Keep knocking the oaks back down to the ground. On the other hand, we may not have had oak savanna on many of the cool north slopes, but there were places where they're on cool north slopes. And as soon as the fire regime goes away, they quickly turn into conifer forest. That's a big 1 meter diameter oak that's still there in the site at Finley. And so really where oaks do best is where there is enough fire to suppress the dug fir, but a little less productive, so there's low fuel loads and fire behavior. Really reliable places for them. And I'd argue that where oaks are in the future is going to likely depend to a great degree on both human ignited or otherwise types of fire in the future. So thinking then from the past to the present, what happened to oak savanna? It turned into many things in the past. 44% went to agriculture, 30% went to forest, 14% to other natural veg types, and about 8% to built features. So where should we put them in the future? I'd argue that we'd look across that full range of productivity and land uses and try to figure out ways to restore not always an intact oak savanna, oak grassland, but the species and the functions of the oak savanna in peri-urban wild and natural areas, urban and rural neighborhoods, public parks, agricultural landscapes, sometimes restored, designed, or even novel ecosystems that haven't been there before. And particularly in places where fire can be introduced or we need risk reduction from future fire. It's notable to say that in that slide on the lower right there, they've done studies where in agricultural landscapes, even a single open-grown oak can provide extreme habitat value to the birds in an otherwise treeless landscape. So we can extract the different pieces of the puzzle and apply them in different places in different ways to recover those functions. But how? What's it going to take? So now I'm going to shift to proposition 2, that the histories of oak savanna grasslands have long been linked to those of indigenous people, and see what lessons we can draw from this. In particular, thinking about to what extent did oak grassland distribution depend on the efforts, actions, and intentions of indigenous people? In particular, their use of fire at larger or smaller spatial scales. So there's a quote here from Jesse Applegate talking about meeting up with a Kalapuya fire in the 1840s, and I've underlined some of the things: a sea breeze, not an east wind, saving their camp, clean sweep, flame and smoke. I mean, fire puts a lot of smoke into the landscape. It was a dramatic event. We have just a few accounts from European American settlers of indigenous fire, and fewer times of them saying that they saw indigenous people set them. But we have plenty of accounts from indigenous elders and their tribal records who speak of using fire since time immemorial. That has tended to be discounted. I think in the last few years, it's raising prominence, but it can't emphasize enough the importance of considering the value and the deep, deep knowledge of our indigenous colleagues. And to understand that, why would that be the case? I just want to paint a picture for you of a timeline that looks at people who were first documented in Oregon around 14,000 years ago. The records from the Willamette Valley suggest at least as long as 8,000 years ago, not longer. Oaks and prairies establishing between about 12 and 8,000 years. And all these thousands of years for indigenous people were living in a landscape with oaks. And to the extent that they were setting those fires and managing them, developing understandings of how to apply fire, where, when, how, to get the goods and services they desired. And if I take that little blip at the end there and I blow it up into the historical period from 1700 to present, post-European American settlement fits here. It's just a tiny piece on this long time of indigenous management. I want to note that we're relying on developing our understanding of ecological restoration. The Society for Ecological Restoration was started in 1987. So let's compare the knowledge we've gained from the Society of Ecological Restoration, 2 generations of restoration ecology versus 500 to 700 generations of indigenous management. I think we could call that time immemorial, and how much knowledge would be accrued during that amount of time. Now, fire isn't the only force that can maintain savanna grasslands. This paper in 2015 has now documented that, in fact, in the Willamette Valley, we had bison, we had mammoth, horse, sloth, and mastodon, about 15,000 to 13,000 years ago. Their demise coincides with changes in regional climate, getting cooling conditions leading to increased forest cover. They note here too that in terms of there's evidence for megafauna human interactions is low. There really is little basis for addressing or understanding the degree to which humans had a role in their extinction or not. But imagine you're living in a prairie system. You've been here a few thousand years. Your economies depend on it. Your cultures have been wrapped around these savanna grasslands. And the grazers have been here, browsing down the fuels, perhaps keeping fire behavior lower. Natural fires are coming through. At what point when the climate changes and your economy begins to shift out from under, do you not, if you haven't already done it, pick up a fire stick and set fire to things? And perhaps even preempt it before the natural fire regime can burn a fire in July or August when it's really dangerous to preempt those fuels and set fuels. So out of that history, it seems pretty clear to argue that there are many things we don't know, but it makes sense. And we have evidence, again, from the Willamette Valley and elsewhere, that people were over long periods of times adapting to the system, changing and managing the landscape to produce the goods and services they wanted to. Calipunya burning practices here on the valley floor have been documented that they applied fire for many different uses, each of which would be used in different conditions, frequencies, spatial extents. But we don't really have a lot of knowledge of how that would add up in total, to how that impacted the fire regime on the valley floor. There have been arguments from a lot of paleoclimatic scientists that, in fact, the climate signal overwhelms the human presence of the landscape. But they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Clearly, people are going to be responding to and using fire, and fire is also going to be responding to climate change. So to understand that question about how did indigenous people use of fire manifest at landscape scales, I want to go uphill and talk a bit about a study that we've been working on where we're looking at indigenous travel routes, persistent sites that appear to have been occupied and managed for many, many long periods of time, and then the legacies of stewardship that we can find up there, often in the vegetation, that suggest how people might have been managing the land. So I'm going to travel up in particular, focus in the Middle Fork watershed. And there's one site up there that I've worked at for more than 20 years now, Jims Creek, elevation about 2,500 feet up in near the headwaters of the Willamette. And I'm going to link together two studies that have participated. One was with Jane Curtis, Scott Bridgham, and our own Jenny Lippert here, where we looked at 7 sites. They're the white sites here of different remnant prairies and oak savanna across the Willamette Valley, most on the valley floor or these lower foothills. And then this one outlier that worked out here way up at Jims Creek, again, approaching up near the Cascade Crest, in an area you don't normally think of oak savannas, in an area that's actually getting up into the Cascadian rainforest. These high elevation rainfall systems we think of as closed canopy forests. So this is our co-producing fire research team, Mike Carlton, Kelly Deere, myself, James Johnson, who I think was in the audience and may be here now, David Lewis, have been really trying to understand indigenous fire stewardship. How did fire frequency and severity covary with indigenous land uses? Were they associated? Did they line up in space and time? And to what extent did indigenous fire stewardship affect landscape scale fire regimes is really the core of our question here. So our study area, there's Oak Ridge, the upper Middle Fork here, Jims Creek is located right about there. And in particular, we're exploring ideas of fire stick farming, used for stewardship, fire for stewardship to gain resource under different conditions, and yards and corridors. The idea that there were these persistent places that were sometimes quite big, that were used, managed, and burned regularly, as well as a set of corridors that were kept open for travel and may often have had fire used in them to maintain those corridors and perhaps serve as fuel breaks. So here's an image from 1845. You can see a white mountain-covered summit or snow-covered summit in the back there. So we're up in the mid-elevations, the Cascades, a very open landscape, very unlike the conifer forest we think of today. And why is it changed? Why is it closed canopy? I think the answer is pretty clear that it was the loss of the fire regime. And again, thinking about to what degree was that fire regime pushed by climate and climate change signal, and what degree was it influenced by humans? It's really the focus of our work. We have a conceptual model. It's a little complicated, but try to walk through of thinking about how under longer term climate influence and fire regimes and vegetation, indigenous people occupying this area that can become closed canopy forest may have been maintaining early seral stands, not burning down forest to create a savanna, but maintaining ones that were there, expanding on fire scars when they happened and maintaining them sometimes, and through their forest stewardship through fire, creating a very dynamic cultural mosaic, provided them benefits, the increased habitat heterogeneity, game, hunting, first foods, potentially a fuel break network. And the outcomes was to not only increased availability and predictability of food and fiber, but perhaps buffering communities from severe wildfire and attenuating risk from climate variability. We're linking together multiple types of evidence from archaeology to ecology, including vegetation change in space and time and legacy imprints from human uses. I want to talk about two of these right now because this is the only slide I'll have. The one is the importance of indigenous trail systems serving as trade and travel routes. This is a mapping based on the General Land Office survey maps from the mid to late 1800s, showing the trail network was there when they got there. So most of these were almost certainly indigenous trails covering almost every ridge you can imagine, some corridors along the lower elevations as well. And just imagine what it would be like if those were also creating sometimes large enough fuel breaks to slow down a fire, and the degree to which those may have been part of the burned mosaic, burning to keep them open or for resource use to enhance plants or for game. We're also looking at the changing technologies that indigenous people have. These example of these changing points over time in some of the sites there. So in this case, looking at a change from spears to atlatls and then bows, changing the hunting regimes and the different ways in which people might have used fire to drive game. In particular, that's one of the uses that could cover large areas when you're trying to move game through the landscape, or you're using fire to renew the forage for elk, for instance. We're examining some legacies like culturally modified ponderosa pines. They were peeled for cambium and pitch production. They can help us understand the spatial distribution of indigenous land use, and they can be aged to determine temporal changes in how people use the sites over time. Jims Creek in particular, in that area up there, working with the Forest Service and their archaeologists, we've mapped 150 of these culturally modified pines up there. We're now working to try to date, getting ready to try to date some of them. So I'm going to jump ahead for a moment to Jims Creek, because I want to tie together this idea of change in the landscape. So this is from Jims Creek. These are maps of the numbers of tree species per hectare and how old they were. And so this first graph here shows that at Jims Creek, starting about 150 years ago, so about 1850 and 1875, an explosion of Douglas fir recruitment. Peaked in about 1875 to 1900, and then began to slow down as the canopy filled in. Hard for me to imagine that this kind of change happened up there other than through the exclusion of fire or the cessation of fire up there. This is long before Smokey the Bear and Forest Service fire exclusion, right? It just, all of a sudden, these Doug firs sprang up at the site. And we look back here at the oaks. These are the older trees, different scale. But notice this black there. That's actually a flush of oak regeneration, which I interpret as being the fire regime slows down or maybe comes to a halt. Those oaks that kept getting knocked back to the ground start sprouting. We see a lot of these multi-trunk oak sprouts up there. It takes the Doug for a little while longer to get the next cohorts coming and for generations to build up mature trees and begin the seed rain over time. But that rapidly leads again from a savanna to a closed canopy forest. And if we look at this work, which has been led by James, it continues to be about fire frequencies up there. What he's found that in sites that are dominated by oaks and pines, we find fire return intervals of 2 to 6 years frequency, every 2 to 6 years of fire, way faster than we expect from climatic fires alone. And that those fire regimes pretty much stop somewhere in the late 1800s. So the coincidence of that explosion of succession of regeneration, and the stopping of fire seems pretty clear. And now I want to hold that in your mind and shift over to, okay, let's try to restore savanna now and see what it takes. And so Jims Creek, it's a 640-acre site here. See this south-facing slope, Young's Rock is up here. Restoration treatment was about 430 acres. You see back in 2005, these little bits of remnant openings, and then there's some clear cuts over there and tons of clear cuts that have sort of eradicated the potential of seeing this kind of landscape in much of the rest of the landscape. And over here is a LiDAR topography diagram we've made. And along it, these circles are permanent plots that we've set in, that we monitored before restoration. We've continued to monitor up until 2 years ago. So what did we find was that Jims Creek in 2005? Well, there was a diversity of plant communities like the ones you see below, from meadows to dense forest. But there is evidence from soils, from living and dead trees and other vegetation legacies that the site was predominantly a savanna grassland circa 1850. Tim Bailey there, one of the people who was doing a forest cruise and really first noted something unusual was going up at Jims Creek, standing by one of the older dead oaks there. There's me standing by a number of large legacy pines and a Doug fir and this dead oak in the forest, many of which, almost all of which, the old ones, exhibited this open grown structure of wide spreading branches, suggesting they developed in a savanna. You can see down below, this was our initial tally of those apparently pre-settlement trees or pre-colonial trees. Most of the oaks were dead. They were logs and snags in the ground. About half the ponderosa pines were dead and many were in decline. And then the Doug firs, not surprisingly, were doing fine in a Doug fir forest. So restoring a savanna using fire isn't the same as sustaining one. It can require that whole list, in fact, did at Jims Creek require this whole list of the following: removing the infill of young trees, triaging on how to save and protect these old stressed trees that are left from the savanna. You got to establish new cohorts of young trees to be the next generation. You've got to reestablish bunch grass dominated ground layers where they've been succeeded and lost due to forest succession. You got to control invasive introduced plants that weren't here 150 years ago. And when you use fire, you've got to do it under conditions that support all of the above. And of course, at some point, you got to finance it too. So I'm going to walk you really quickly through some of these changes we saw on the site: logging treatments, restoration, thinning of all Doug fir under 20 inches from 2008 to 2011. Followed a number of years later by prescribed fire, which continues to be used at the site. And this is a before and after photo, just to give you an extent of what it was like, the change. I would get lost out there. I knew the site, and I get lost after it was done because we went from what looked like this to this very, very open woodland savanna on the site. Now I want to go over you some of the, so what happened? So the first question we were faced from the beginning and we posed was, what's more difficult to restore, the canopy layer or the ground? Not surprisingly, the Forest Service had more experience thinning trees than they did in restoring ground layer at the point. And there was a lot of discussion about the degree to which, if you just thinned the canopy layer, the ground layer could be restored. And we did try to do a bunch of work with seeding plots out there, but at that time, it was simply not possible to produce enough seed to bulk it out and to seed the site as a whole. A lot of the practices that we now sort of accept are needed. But there was a lot of success at the site. These encircling rings of oaks around the edge of the shallow soil meadows have been released as part of a large savanna grasslands. Some areas have the intended canopy cover of ponderosa pines, and that's a person in there for scale. Some of the large old released oaks are healthy. They're unlikely to ever recover their original open grown crown, all these limbs that have broken off down low, but they're still alive and serving valuable habitat functions. And some of the smaller, younger oaks that were suppressed are doing epicormic sprouting, beginning to gain new branches and canopy cover. Here's one up on the ridgetop here that was just literally nursing its own death of hundreds of Doug fir underneath it in the shade and moist music environment of that canopy. So that once released, the oak's on its own again. But it didn't all work out either. Here's a large open-grown oak in the middle of a meadow. There were no trees around it. It was thinned behind it there. And then we got the 2015 drought. I think a combination of its vernal seep dried up, probably during the drought, and quite likely the thinning created more open conditions, winds coming through, drying out the soil, and that tree's struggling to on its last legs right now. Some of those large ponderosa pines, like the one my students are gathered around the lower left, you can see on the right side there, did not make it. Some of those have blown down, become tip-ups, or some of them burned at the prescribed fires. And in 2016, there was a big blowdown. It was an uncommon and powerful east wind event. It hit the trees in the direction to which their roots had not been accustomed. And a lot of those trees blew down. So it's really a mixed bag up there that's happened. There's been successes. There have been things that didn't come through. In particular, I think that one of the answers is this project's about 50 years too late. So many of those large trees were already weakened. I mean, when we do this, we need to come in as early as we can while the trees are still healthy. And we're also facing climate change and continuing conditions, which we're going to have to come to terms with as we try to restore and recreate savannas. Well, what about that old ground layer there? Here's an area. This is a remnant prairie on the left-hand side there. It is some of the most diverse and most intact grassland that I've seen in the Willamette Valley. There's 5 native grasses there, a diversity of forbs. This is where the cut line is. There's stumps out here. It was not seeded, and the native grasses didn't move out. It's almost completely dominated by invasive annual grasses there. In fact, in some places, there's a sea of introduced native grasses, like our good old favorites, Sinosaurus echinacus. In particular, in areas that are hot and dry and unseeded, and prescribed fire was applied. And at this point, you've got millions of seeds out there. Well, what if you didn't do prescribed burns? Here on some of these more mesic areas, the ceanothus would take over, and you have shrub thickets. And now when you put fire through there, it is hot enough and the flame lengths are big enough, it can scorch trees. Even without fire, it's suppressing the tree seedlings and all the grassland species. So you've got a tough dilemma up there about how to manage the site. So too little fire, shrub thickets, too much fire and not the quite right and lack of seeding. You've got these invasive annuals. And the hard part is you're trying to use fire to both suppress succession, Doug fir seedlings, but to allow through that next generation of Quercus caryonae and ponderosa pine. So it's a tough one. I would argue it's going to take a lot more tending and care than industrial scale restoration. And how do you do that at large spatial extents? It's the dilemma that I've got some ideas about, but certainly there are no easy answers to. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through some of these next slides here. We've done other studies in the Willamette Valley, experimental, about climate change in grasslands. And one of the conclusions was that problem we have with annual invasive grasses is just likely to get bigger. And one of the issues with annual invasive grasses is they change the fuels from discontinuous fuel beds of bunch grasses that stay green late in the season to continuous fuel beds of completely senesced grasses ready to burn by early summer. So you really got to get them on at the beginning. And I want to talk a bit about the seeding of native bunch grasses versus natural generation. And if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then a video is worth a book. And let this run. It may be a little herky-jerky because I'm on my home wireless here.
We're looking out here at Jim's Creek Restoration Area near the Youngs Rock Trail, June 7th, 2022. And what you're looking out here, among all the stumps from the restoration thinning to restore a grassland, is in fact grasses. But more than that, they are invasive annual grasses. Sinosaurus echinatus, Bromus diandrus, Vulpia species, and in places, Bromus tectarum cheatgrass. It's extremely high cover. These individuals are producing millions upon millions of seeds that are now part of the seed bed here. What's even more remarkable is that where in a small number of experimental plots, we were able to seed the native bunchgrass, Romus fescue, it's holding its own. You'll see almost no invasive annual grasses in among the Romus fescue, this thin bluish green grass here. What's even more interesting and notable is that in this plot, it wasn't just roamers that were seeded. There was a mix of a number of forbs, wildflowers, native forbs, but also there was intended to be the native bunchgrass California fescue, so we could understand where the roamers would do best and where the California would do best. Unfortunately, the seed collectors collected tall fescue, Chaudoneris arundinaceus, one of the most invasive perennial grasses in the Willamette Valley that I have encountered. And in fact, in most of the areas on this plot, the roamers is outperforming the Chaudoneris. Probably in part, this is due to, this is a hot, dry site, and the Chaudoneris does not do well here, whereas the romer's fescue as a drought-tolerant, stress-tolerant species is doing well.
Cut it there. But it's impressive. So Jenny, you happy with that? Let me get back to my screen here. So there's lessons. I don't have time to go through, just reiterating the points that there's been a mixture of things that have gone well and have not gone well there. A lot of it gets back then to how prescribed fire fits into the picture and the challenges that we face now of putting fire back in there, not just to sustain a native savanna with no invasive species, but how to help recreate one from scratch when you're trying to get this next generation of trees growing, you're faced with invasive animals. There's some real hope there too. We were not able, for the reasons I said before, to seed in California fescue. And in part, I think some of the people in the Forest Service who felt we didn't need to seed, it was because they'd seen California fescue come back very strong in other places where they just simply cut the trees before. Here it is in a really good year on a mesic site, recovering on its own, right? Small suppressed individuals under the forest cover, because California's fescue is partially shade tolerant, recovered, exploded like this. They're 3-foot tall foliage. Tillers were 5 to 6 foot tall. The elk love it. It's fantastic elk browse. And of course, the Savannah sparrows and other sparrows up there nest underneath it there. It has not spread to new areas, just like the romer's fescue did not spread. It appears to require seedling, at least in the short term, and particularly soon enough to get it out before the invasive annuals take place. But you'll notice here in the foreground, you can see some invasive annuals, those are Cynosaurus there. But really, once you get under that California fescue, there's not that many annuals there. And I think there's some real hope. One of the questions that really, boy, I want to figure this out if possible before I finish this all, is finding these tall fescues. There's a handful of seed I collected up there. Just wonder the degree to which fescue might have been one of the targets for first foods up there. There's really no records we have of the people up here using tall fescue. I do want to note, because I forgot before, was the Kalapuya were not likely up here using the land much. It was the Molalla, was the Klamath, and the Eastern Paiute. And in particular, those trade routes likely brought people from the valley floor and foothills up to these high elevation sites in the summers. We also had people, the Eastern Paiute, coming over from the east side to come over to this much moister forest savanna side over here on the west. But certainly there's been documentation such as Cat Anderson's of edible seeds and grains in California. There's been documentation of the use of grass grains in Idaho. Really wonder whether it might have been part of the reason for the use of this site here. So I'm going to wrap up with a couple last sections here. Apologize for going a bit longer than I'd planned on, but wanted to give you the full story here. Talk about tending the wild. Some idea, the phrase was Cat Anderson, a friend and colleague of mine, brought it out of her work with the Miwok in Northern California. And then thinking about a different way to use fire and having listened to people like Aggie Baker Pilgrim of the Takelma tribe, who spoke of cool burns outside the main fire season. Actually heard her castigate a bunch of fire researchers at a conference sponsored by the Forest Service when I first arrived in Eugene, where she said, of course you don't find fire scar records in your trees of us. What do you think we were doing? You think we were dumb up there? We were burning in the cool season. We're doing cool burns. They didn't leave no signs. This long tradition of understanding the landscape and when and how to burn, which so much of the knowledge has been lost, and yet we have some carriers of knowledge such as Aggie Baker Pilgrim here. But I want to bring this into my proposition 3 then. That the care, attention, and sophistication we see in indigenous people's processing of grassland goods and services was likely matched by their management activities. So when you look at the art and the functionality of the products that were built from the grassland, we look at the food bowl here, the women's hat, the basket there, the quality of materials that had to go making it into them, the artistry and the care and the sophistication that was used to build them. Wouldn't you think they were sophisticated and managed the landscape as they were in producing these goods and services? And wouldn't they needed to have been? So people like Kat Anderson, drawing from her work again, working with the Miwok and other tribes in Northern California, documented the complexity of the ways that people managed and used oaks and the ways in which they managed the oak savannas. The ground layer, the canopy layer. We look at the types of tools that were made, the sophistication of the preparation practices for these critical, economically valuable services. And wouldn't you expect cultures with such sophisticated collection and processing of acorns and other plant species to have similarly sophisticated and nuanced use of fire to manage oak grasslands, habitats for the desired goods and services? That's just what I mean by first principles here. So lastly, I want to talk a little about this idea of recovering knowledge of place. That proposition 4 I've been leading toward, it took time to try to build up with you here, that we need to prepare the land to receive and transmit fire safely at broad spatial extents with the sophistication and localized place knowledge of the indigenous cultures who inhabited and managed this land for thousands of years. Not to do what they had done, not to manage the same landscape, but to actually think about how we can get fire back into the land. And so reintroducing fire isn't as simple as lighting a match. How do we target plant species and ecological communities for restoration across a project site? How do we avoid some of the problems or get around what we learned at Jim's Creek? And how do we support them, particularly in these highly altered landscapes, using fire at the right time, right place to support the desired things we want to get out of it? So one of the parts of the project I've been working on with students to continue our work at Jim's Creek is this idea of physiographic site units, or ecotopes, that was identified by Bart and Barnes and built from a model in Germany, where we try to develop discrete mappable site units based on topography and soils that could support a variety of potential vegetation types, but they're more permanent on the land. They last there. There's moist, dry areas. There's hot, dry ridges. And trying to redevelop some intimate, spatially explicit knowledge of sites using our science that'll help us manage the land better. And so we're using LiDAR and GIS analytical tools in conjunction with our site data of reconstructed historical communities in response to restoration to try to identify these mappable land unit types. And then, for example, we've identified the types and range of locations where oaks have persisted and done well over long periods of time. And we've identified how different bunch grasses dominate in different soil productivities, so that seeding and management, including fire, could be targeted to supporting bunch grasses across their range of variability. You know, with the oaks, there are these droughty vernal swales and ridge lines and lower metal edges where water is running off of these shallow soils and irrigating the oaks at the bottom of the meadow, and yet the fuels are reduced up near that droughty meadow edge, so when a fire comes up, it's less likely to burn the oak and knock it back to the ground. It's that kind of subtlety of site knowledge we want to harness. I won't talk about this, but it's one of the sort of conceptual models we've been building about understanding the overlapping of the different bunchgrass niches and how they sort of fill that niche across a range of soil moistures and canopy covers, so that under almost any condition up there except dense forest, we're going to be able to have bunch grasses of one species or another. They're able to dominate and be part of our arsenal to keep the invasive exotics out. So I want to return to the idea, the last couple slides here, that mosaics of oak savanna grasslands and forest can be a critical component of climate resilience strategies, while simultaneously supporting native biodiversity. It should involve the reestablishment of a strong role for indigenous fire stewardship by the tribes, and I'd argue that we need to integrate our scientific approaches with their knowledge to develop practical tools for managing the complexities of reinstituting human fire in the landscape. So using these 4 propositions, I built a case that oaks and the grasslands have been around for a long time. They're likely to do well in the future. They have a role in climate mitigation, and yet we have a lot of challenges that we need to tie together different threads of history and looking to the future to learn how to manage them well. And in particular, we need to be able to support these oak savannas in continuing to fill their ecological role for biodiversity while providing goods and services to people, including the greater resilience to climate change and protection from catastrophic fire. So this is our Willamette Valley Oak and Prairie community plan, is part of an alliance of groups, including the Cascadia Prairie Oak Partnership, the PNW Oak Alliance, who really have been trying to understand landscape scale strategies for restoring oak habitats, oak pine savannas, grasslands, and prairies. People are trying to create a vision of a business plan for how this is managed ecologically. There's been a resurgence of interest in engaging the tribes and having them co-managing the land with them. Groups around where indigenous fire crews are being working. So I see a lot of hope in the future. It's a huge challenge, but I think it's worth it. And I'm going to stop talking so that we have a few minutes. We can actually have time for some conversation about it. So thank you. Stop sharing so you can see people. So Gail, do you want to engage a few questions here? Gail, you're muted.
Yes, now I'm unmuted. Yeah, thanks, Bart. That was great. And I really appreciate you filling us in on the understory, the ground layer. I had questions about that and you pretty much answered them quite well. In our chat, let's see, there were a couple of questions, and Adam says, thank you very much for this great presentation. Tangentially, I'm wondering if you might please know if anyone has looked at why the Willamette Valley's undisturbed grasslands tend to be free of surface stones. I presume the explanation is geological, but surface stones, maybe rocky outcrops, you might mean. Can you address that, Bart?
Not really. Thank you, Adam, for the question. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of them are deep soils, right? In the Willamette Valley floor, you had the Missoula floods that brought in 100 feet of topsoil from Washington. So one might not expect to find a lot of stones in areas that had been topsoil washing from Washington. Certainly, when we get up onto some of the more best remaining savannas we have now, there's a lot of rocks and there are a lot of rocky outcrops. Not as many as you might find further up in the mountains there where you have steeper slopes, but plenty of them. And that's in part because most of the remnant savannas that we have left are the ones that have been on those harsh, dry sites that were too steep to build, too unproductive to agriculture, too difficult for Doug Furs to colonize in the absence of fire. So I guess I have somewhat different observations, but interesting question. Got another one there?
Great. Yeah. To what degrees are you able to continue this work in your retirement, in your emeritus status? There's so much.
Go ahead.
It just says there's so much left to discover.
A lot of work for a lot less pay. That's what I have. Well, you know, I think those of us who got into this work, we didn't do it for the money. We could have gone to law or business or something else. And so it's a passion for me. I am trying to slow down. I would like some more time just to go wander the woods again and to play my guitar and things. But, you know, it's work that's never done, right? And I feel like I've been part of a chain of people who have been trying to do this, and there's just so much to learn. And our understanding and the pictures change and evolve so rapidly over time. I'm old enough that I went to the first Society for Ecological Restoration conference in Florida. And I went to the first conservation biology conference in 1985 at University of Michigan. And I've watched this field develop through a lot of hard work, a lot of lessons, a lot of mistakes along the way. We've certainly been through times where we realized how much of the conservation movement that we have lauded and valued was in fact had a deep undercurrent, and sometimes a surface current of racism to it that has had awful implications for how we have ignored the knowledge and the wisdom of indigenous people, and are now, frankly, as we're trying to work with indigenous tribes, turn into small numbers of people who are so pressed from so many sides, give us a hand, help us out. It's like, how do they do it? You know, and I think part of it is respect for when we ask our indigenous colleagues to work with us. that we're getting paid a salary, they need to be paid a salary too, you know, and they need to be brought into this picture and given tools to it. So I just see myself as trying to open doors and gates. You know, I hope my students and others out there who are pursuing similar traits are going to carry it to the next generation. You hang around long enough that maybe you got a little bit of hard-earned wisdom there you can pass along, but you start to sit back a little bit more. So.
Well, a couple more questions have come in, and one is, are you aware of any relic savannas in the Central Coast Range? The Siuslaw National Forest is beginning to look at restoring some of the meadows.
Yeah, you know, I know less over there. Most of the meadows I've
Okay.
seen are near the bluffs, right? So you have a lot of the silver spot butterfly and the bluffs there, and certainly along the edge there were meadows and prairies up there. I don't know, and I'm not aware of much oaks up there, up the mountains. Some others may be. I can't really speak to that. But the importance, again, whether they were there before or not, if we're facing greater fire in areas that tend towards stand replacing fires, and if we're trying to reduce the likelihood those stand replacing fires are going to get out of control and move on, is having these mosaics up there can be really important with grasslands where the fire can drop down to the ground. We've got points for suppression and control. So it's a variety of reasons why one should think about creating grassland areas, even in areas that may not have historically happened. But thank you for bringing that up.
And Biddy's asking, what is the return interval for poison oak? How often, how often would you need to burn to reduce it?
It's a really darn good question. And my experience is poison oak, if it's not established, can be probably kept out, probably with less frequent fire, right? But once it's established, fire just tickles it and it comes back in. And I don't have an answer for that one yet. But I think it takes, you know, reasonably frequent fire to burn it down. To get rid of it, whole other question.
What was the diversity or the abundance of poison oak originally? Any idea?
I don't, but I've certainly heard some people speculate and question and say, if I've been out in this landscape for a few thousand years and I knew that I could keep it down by burning with a little fire, maybe that'd be a good thing to do. So perhaps fire would be used to control poison oak.
It would be nice to know its original distribution, abundance. Another question, how does the big leaf maple contribute to these savannas?
You know, it's interesting. If you go up around Finley now in Basket Slough areas, you can find areas where they're maple. My understanding of them, though, is, again, resilience or resistance to fire is a function largely of bark thickness. Douglas fir and ponderosa pine, they're big enough. They got thick bark. They're very fire resistant where they're young. It's thin bark or they're not. Oaks have thin bark. They're not particularly fire resistant until they get really big. Maples have thinner bark. I mean, maples just do not survive fire as well as madrones don't, but they tend to resprout. My guess is that there were not many maple savannas. It would just not be, they're not a species as well there. We certainly see them, they moved into these music sites over time. A lot of those 7 sites that I showed you before, were 6 sites, where we were looking at these older savannas that had turned much to a large degree into forest. We saw maples in there, many times multi-sprout. What we realized was people had actually maintained these savannas and the oaks unintentionally for quite a bit of time by high grading out the Doug fir and cutting back the maples. So, but you certainly can have maple oak ecosystems now in the absence of fire.
That's great. Well, let's see. Oh, another question came in. You're inspiring us.
Out here.
All right. Yeah, let's take at least this question. Combining this with Doug Talamay's recommendation for habitat in cities, can you picture savanna corridors through suburban lawns that are replaced with native grasses?
Well, if you want to come by my front yard, you can see my answer to that. We've been regrowing the oaks in my front yard, and we've got a lot of native grasses and forbs there. It's a challenge. There's a lot of work, like any garden, and they're invasive annuals, so it's a challenge now, but we have a little prairie out in our front yard. I think there are places where we can do it, certainly in novel areas. For instance, we're looking at trying to create stormwater in above ground stormwater infrastructures, right? And there are opportunities, perhaps as we move toward smaller cars and autonomous vehicles in the future, and we get away from using so many cars, to take away some of the lanes, not just for traffic and parking lots, and put them back into green systems. And actually creating stormwater systems along existing roads, wide corridors would be a great thing. And native grasses and forbs are great for them. And oaks do fine when they got their feet wet. So there's no reason we can't put oaks into wetland corridors like that. I think you just have to be creative. I spent, a few decades trying to encourage my students to think out of the box by that. So I'd say yes, absolutely. We're also demonstrating in public parks around Eugene how one can bring in oak savanna species and grasslands for beauty, sometimes in very cultured settings and sometimes in very wild ones, like we have on the South Hills. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of work that's trying to restore those oak savanna grasslands in the South Hills, both for recreational values, they're beautiful, they're diversity, but as fire breaks.
Okay, well, I can also support the native brunch grasses in yards. Ours are doing quite well and they add a nice structure to our yard.
I have to
So-
add that I think that one thing other point, for those of you who hung on for so long, we have typically used Romer's fescue in the valley as our native bunch grass, our dominant upland prairie bunch grass. We've got a different bunch grass, Deschampsia in the wetlands. But I think we may have missed the boat there because we think of California fescue as living in woodlands. What I think has happened is the California fescue, like at Jims Creek, was out in these more mesic areas and deeper soils. And it persists there when the oaks and the trees grow in, and it can persist in partial shade. And I think we really need to look at trying to bring back California fescue and experimenting. Maybe it won't do as well on the valley floor as it does in the mountains. Although frankly, on those south-facing slopes at Jims Creek, it's as hot as anything I've ever experienced on the valley floor. And they're big, they can outcompete tall fescue up there. That's pretty remarkable in our prairies down here. So I think let's keep looking at those native grasses. Grow them in your own yard, try to figure it out.
Somebody said, Ariana said, don't forget Danthonia californica.
Love that one
Okay.
too.
Yeah. Okay, we'll take one last question and everybody can open their at least their video and clap for Bart. But the last question, have you encouraged the Forest Service to start developing seed sources for savanna planting of Romer's fescue and California fescue, especially since they are planning on implementing some large-scale vegetation manipulation around the watershed where Jims Creek is located in the near future?
I have advocated verbally in many situations to many individuals. I'm still writing out my reports. I'm behind on writing my reports, but yes, I think that's absolutely essential. And it's difficult, right? You have to do, for areas that large, we have to grow and bulk out a lot of seeds. We faced that with the city of Eugene, and others faced that in their early restoration efforts and at Mount Pisgah too. We just didn't have a market for the seeds. And it took a long time to build a commercial market of, again, wild collecting seeds, bulking them up, producing them, getting out the side. And in certainly our restorations that we're doing in the valley floor, it is accepted best management practice now to seed when you're restoring savannas and grasslands, including putting them out after fire. It's going to take an enormous amount of effort, and it's going to take a lot of money. We're going to have to finance this. And I think it's absolutely essential to seed out grasses in the beginning when one's thinned to forest there. There are some cases where we found in those mesic areas, this is part of the work we're doing. We can identify the types of mesic areas that have suppressed California fescue that may come back on its own without reseeding. And there are clearly areas, the drier sites, which aren't good for the California fescue, where it's been lost, you need to seed. So we can be smart about where to seed, and we can try to make it most economically efficient by using those physiographical site units. But yes, we need to be seeding, and we need to be seeding following burns too, to try to keep them building their numbers up. Great question.
That's great. We do have one more question. Do we have time or should we wrap it up?
Anybody can leave when they need to, but yeah, I'm here.
All right, I'll ask this last question, then I promise we can applaud you. This kind of comes with a bit of preamble. As we move to encourage more fire, this person knows that I know that have moist barriers, which were traditionally in the landscape, can help mitigate the burning edge. You mentioned this with Grandma Aggie, and I know that Dr. David Lewis is focusing on the importance of the disrupted watersheds. Is this being considered in restoration? Did you understand that, Bart?
I didn't quite, maybe the,
Yeah,
Maybe-
it's about
Yeah.
disrupted watersheds. I guess moist barriers.
oh, I see what you're saying. So I think there's a lot of
Okay.
ways that we can think about fuel, I'll call them fuel breaks for a moment here. Ways,
Yeah.
again, to create grassland systems or very open, sparsely treated systems where you're much more likely to have a surface fire on the ground. It's difficult for the fire to climb up into the trees because you don't have fuel ladders, and if it does get into the trees, they tend to torch, but because the crowns aren't interlocking, it's less likely to spread from one tree to another. So there are many ways to do that. Certainly moist areas and riparian areas can often serve as fire breaks because the humidity is higher. You've got a river there, you've got a highway there. At some point, when fire behavior and weather is extreme enough, and if the flame lengths are tall enough, particularly up in the trees, fire is going to spot over those barriers, it's going to go over the place. So, at some point under extreme fire, it's going to move. But we can do an awful lot to create areas in the landscape that either by themselves damp down fire behavior or allow people to come in and gain control over it and to do suppression when it's needed. I've worked with a lot of hard-baked fire specialists over on the east side in a current project we're doing. We're looking at prickly wildfire and prescribed fire into the next century up around Bend and the western Deschutes County. And they talk about their vision, these hard-baked fire guys and women, is to be able to sit on their back porch, drinking a beer, watching fire creep through the neighborhood, right? Safely, without damage, without danger. And through doing that, remove the fuels that make it, again, a safer place to live. We're going to have to deal with smoke. Fire, even prescribed fire, creates smoke. And there's a real cost to that we have to address. And some people have real health issues with that. But I think there are ways both to create these corridors and breaks, but also just landscapes that at large scales just allow fire to move through much more gently. And many times what we need to do is we need to preempt the fires that occur in those hot, dry times of the year by setting fires earlier on to reduce the fuel loads. So I think it really needs a landscape strategy. I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, thanks, Bart. I think we'll wrap it up. You can all unmute at least and video or show us your videos. And we really want to thank you. Yes. Thank you very much, Bart.
Wish I'd seen you all in person. I was looking forward to actually seeing real human beings. But
Yeah, we were too.
Thank you all. Thank you for the questions there. Appreciate it. And I'm always happy to follow.
Great presentation.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bart.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was
Thank you
great.
so much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, folks.